was created in 1920 by a man named Christian Nelson. It was a random creation due to a child not being able to decide whether or not he wanted ice cream or chocolate, and so he combined the two to create the famous Eskimo pie. The Jungle Gym. It was created in 1920 by a lawyer named Sebastian Hinton. Traffic lights. Invented in 1920 by William Potts, a police officer from Detroit. It was first used in Michigan avenues in Detroit, United States. The Band-Aid. Made in 1924 by Earl Dickinson. He used gauze and tape to tend his wife's wounds, and when he told his boss, who worked at the company Johnson & Johnson, he liked the idea. Therefore, the creation of the Band-Aid. The hair dryer. In 1920, the first hair dryer was invented. Women tried using vacuum cleaners as hair dryers at first, until finally someone who was anonymous invented the hair dryer. The lie detector. It was created in 1921 by Johnson A. Larson. Water skiing. Invented in 1922 by Ralph Samuelson. He water skied for the first time using a clothesline and a pair of boards. The instant camera. Invented by Samuel Shafrock in 1923. The famous cheeseburger. It was created by Lionel Sternberger in 1924. The moviola. Invented by Iwan Serurier in 1924. It helped the movie industry because it allowed the producers to edit the film while watching it at the same exact time. The drive-thru. It was created in 1926, and the first organization to use it was the City Center Bank. Many places started getting it after it was first used. The jukebox. Invented in 1927 by the Automatic Music Instrument Company. Bubblegum. Created in 1928 by Walter Deemer, it was marketed under the name Double Bubble, and its sales rocketed to 1.5 million its first year. The electric razor, invented in 1928 by Colonel Jacob Schick. Penicillin, created by Sir Alexander Fleming, a scientist who studied bacteria. At first, the FDA did not approve of penicillin, and it was not until after World War I that it was first used. Politics of the 1920s. During the 1920s, 3 Republicans occupied the White House: Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. Harding was inept, Coolidge was mediocre, and Hoover was overcome by circumstances he neither understood nor could control. Harding's campaign slogan, "A return to normalcy," best describes American politics for the entire period. The nation turned away from the progressive era and also the moral vision of Wilson's wartime leadership toward a government whose domestic economic policies opposed federal regulation and encouraged business expansion. The Harding administration. Although he was very popular, Harding was naive, which made him an awful president. For his administration, he chose Charles Evans Hughes as Secretary of State, Henry Wallace as Secretary of Agriculture, Herbert Hoover as Secretary of Commerce, and Andrew Mellon as Secretary of the Treasury. Several of Harding's other appointments left much to be desired, however, and resulted in major scandals that rocked the government. Charles Forbes headed the newly formed Veterans Bureau, even though he had carefully avoided the draft. He was convicted of fraud and related felonies involving the agency's hospital construction funds. Meanwhile, the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, was at the center of the Teapot Dome scandal, in which he secretly leased naval oil reserves at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California, to private companies headed by Edward Doheny and Harry F. Sinclair in return for no-interest, non-collateral loans. After resigning his office, Fall was convicted of bribery, and the government canceled the leases. The administration was even more disgraced when Attorney General Henry M. Daughtry was implicated in a bribery case involving an official in the Alien Property Office and was indicted but acquitted for taking money from liquor dealers evading prohibition. Harding was not directly involved with the corruption, and he died in office on August 2, 1923, before the charges against his appointees became public. Coolidge in the election of 1924. Harding's vice president, Calvin Coolidge, came to national attention in 1919 when, as governor of Massachusetts, he ended the Boston police strike. Coolidge did not believe the president should take an activist role in government, and he was as opposed to the regulation of business as Harding had been. His famous quip, "The business of America is business," summed up the Republican creed of the 1920s. An honest, if taciturn man who had no connection with the scandals of his predecessor's cronies, Coolidge was the Republican choice for president in 1924. The Democrats found it harder to choose candidates, and the two main Democratic contenders, John Davis and Robert La Follette, mirrored the split in American society that existed during the time. Coolidge won decisively in both the popular and electoral vote. The election of Hoover. When Coolidge decided not to run for a second term in 1928, the Republicans nominated Herbert Hoover. Even though he had never held elective office, Secretary of Commerce Hoover had a distinguished career in public service and was well regarded for his work with the Food Administration and in relief efforts after the war. The Democrats nominated Governor Al Smith. With the country still riding the high tide of prosperity that the Republicans took full credit for, Hoover was nearly impossible to beat, especially with Smith's serious drawbacks as a candidate. The Democratic Party's platform supported prohibition, but Smith favored the repeal of the 18th Amendment. Additionally, anti-Catholicism remained a factor in American politics. Many Protestant churches, both fundamentalist and mainstream denominations, urged their parishioners to vote their faith. The combination of prohibition and religion cost Smith several states in the Deep South and contributed to Hoover's landslide victory.